While the EU is drawing some limits for online content, the US is far from considering being forgotten a right.
We in the United States do not have a right to be forgotten. Both the Congress and courts have long sided with people's right to know and speak freely without fear of censorship. But that does not stop the conversation from entering into our public discourse.
The right to be forgotten.
The right to be forgotten.
The right to be forgotten.
A poll conducted in 2020 by the Pew Research Center found that 74% of U.S. adults felt it was more important to keep personal, even damning information about them from turning up online than it was to learn information about others. So, what is the current state of U.S. content regulation?
When you're talking about the right to be forgotten, you're really talking about privacy laws. And in the United States, we do have privacy laws, but we really value the First Amendment and freedom of speech over the right to privacy, which I think is the big difference between our privacy laws in the United States versus in the EU. Hi, my name is Allie Arco, and I'm an attorney at Corman, Jackson, and Krantz in Ohio. I focus my practice primarily on internet defamation and content removal. So anything that relates to an internet issue, defamation occurring online, or any sort of internet content popping up in search results that is harming someone.
Allie works on the front line of helping people regain control over their online presence.
For the most part, people that come to me that are looking to have content removed are doing it because they are at a point of desperation. They're not able to work. They can't secure employment. They can't financially support themselves because content is so damaging. It's complicated because there's definitely an inherent value to the public for there to be freedom of information and a free flow of truthful facts really on the internet. But there's also a point where people are harmed and can't attain work when they have negative content posted about them on the internet. And there's also information that might have been true at the time that's no longer true. So for example, if someone is charged with a crime and they get exonerated in court, it's true that they were charged for that crime. So there could be a news article saying they were charged with no follow-up, and that could be really damaging, even if a person was falsely accused and was completely exonerated in court. So I think that there are definitely situations where content should be removed. And I think it's complicated to think about all of the different ways that this could happen. I think specifically for minors, this is a huge issue that is really only growing as our reliance on the internet grows.
Well, first of all, you can't sue the websites to get information off. They're protected.
That's Paul Sternberg, an attorney based in Houston, Texas, who also practices defamation and content removal law. He shared with me his experience in helping people manage their online presence.
There's a statute called the Communication Decency Act, and essentially what that does is that protects the websites. And the history behind it, which I think is really interesting, is there was an initial case in the 80s with CompuServe and Prodigy. They got sued by some individuals that were defamed on their websites. They went before Congress, and they said, listen, if we don't have complete immunity, we're going to shut down the comments on the Internet. And so Congress said freedom of speech, and they gave complete immunity to the websites. So as long as the website doesn't write the defamatory content, as long as they don't have any material alteration to what someone else writes or posts, they cannot be sued. So how do you get information removed? Well, there's several ways. Number one, if you have a high presence on the Internet, it's practically impossible. I mean, it just is. If you have a smaller presence, then obviously you would close the accounts that you have access to. Normally you can go to the website and see what their parameters are for taking your name off of it. Some websites just won't do it, and there's really not much you can do about that. So essentially in the end, complete content removal from the Internet, if you have any presence at all, is fairly difficult unless you have a valid reason to get it removed.
All right. So laws in the U.S. primarily back content providers in the First Amendment, but you can still get content removed from the internet. How does that work?
I would say it really depends on the type of content you're talking about. But if you're talking about revenge porn, that may be easier to remove than a photo that someone consented to being posted on the internet. If you're talking about a news article, an article that's old, an article that is related to something that was expunged or sealed, those would be easier to remove. But I think there's also certain things subject matter wise that are more difficult to remove. And that would be anything related to a financial crime, anything related to something sexual in nature, anything that's gone viral. And a huge difficulty actually in content removal, which is interesting, that's not just United States based, is actually where the content's published. So if content's published on a US site, they have to adhere to US law, and that makes it a lot easier to attain removal. But anymore, the internet is really not just domestic. And so if content's posted on a website that's hosted overseas, removal efforts may be much more difficult.
With all this in mind, is there a possibility of a European Union-style right to be forgotten being enacted in the United States?
I think it'd be really hard in the United States to create a right to be forgotten that applies to the media the way it does in Europe. I think that's the biggest barrier in the United States. I'm Daniel Castro, Vice President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, or ITIF. ITIF's a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focusing on innovation policies. So basically, how can we get more innovation in society and in the economy that benefits consumers and businesses? And my focus in particular is around tech policy. So, looking at everything from drones to the internet to AI to understanding, how we can have policy that allows for responsible and positive innovation.
U.S. citizens, just as any other citizen in Europe, care about their privacy. But U.S. and EU law are obviously very different. With this understanding, Daniel has looked to other ways to have greater privacy on the internet while balancing the right to free speech and our collective right to know.
So in the conversations that I'm seeing right now in the United States around what data protection legislation should look like, it tends to be a little more balanced than what we saw in Europe, where the starting point was, there's a set of rights that we want to enumerate here and, give to individuals regardless of the cost. We're just starting from the rights perspective. In the US, there is an interest in establishing certain consumer data protection rights, but I think they're usually based more on, this kind of commercial relationship between an individual and a business, rather than the European approach, where it's more about citizens' rights. Your right as a European fundamentally starts with your ability to control information about you by anyone, full stop. On a commercial level, when you're talking about a company that has a direct relationship with an individual, I think we're likely to continue to see regulation in that space. Where I think it starts to get a lot murkier is when you're talking about, for lack of a better word, data brokers, companies that are buying and selling data about consumers, especially when that data is from public records or when it's factual. So, for example, if you can get from many state and local governments voting records, right, or you can get land ownership information, tax records. A lot of these things are public, and companies can compile that data and buy and sell it.
Individual states have in recent years worked to pass their own data privacy laws that aim at giving residents of those states an enhanced ability to control their data. Most recently, Californians in 2020 passed Proposition 24, which gave citizens the ability to prevent businesses from sharing personal information, including information relating to their race, religion, sexual orientation, location, and education level. Both Virginia and Colorado have passed laws directed at consumer data privacy, with more laws being introduced in states across the country. But is this the best approach, to have states decide on data privacy law and not the federal government?
I think having the federal government, having Congress pass a federal data privacy legislation would be enormously beneficial for consumers, because then there would be one set of rights for everyone. They wouldn't be confused about what they are. It'd be easier to educate consumers about them, but also it would be, just vastly simpler for companies to comply, because they wouldn't have to try and figure out what the rules are in 50 different states that are constantly changing. They'd be able to, just invest efficiently in actually serving consumers and serving them effectively. So hopefully we're moving in that direction. What's interesting is Europe's data protection law, the GDPR, was actually created because Europe had such a fragmented approach to data protection with all the different member states implementing it differently. And so one of the main reasons the GDPR was passed was to say, across Europe, there should be one set of rules. And what's interesting is in the United States, we seem to be going in the opposite direction with a very, 50 different approaches right now.
Any legislation that targets how information is shared and lives on the internet will have a deep impact on content providers, especially the news media. But journalists are people too, who value privacy and the ability to move on from past mistakes.
And especially in the past, say, 5 to 8 years, especially how crime reporting has changed as our resources have changed in newsrooms. And I think a big part of it for me was one of the things that I got when I came to Aspen was a lot of people would ask, oh, you guys wrote this story 10 years ago when I had a misdemeanor, cocaine possession or a DUI or something like that. And it's, I can't get a job and it continues to haunt me. And why do you guys still have that up? And so that was really the impetus for me to say, okay, why do we have those up and why are they still important for people?
That's David Krause. He's the editor of the Aspen Times in Aspen, Colorado. He helped implement a right to be forgotten policy at the Times and has been accepting requests from people to be forgotten from past news stories.
We are a group of newspapers here in Colorado, the Aspen Times, the Vail Daily, the Summit Daily outside of Breckenridge, the Steamboat Pilot, Glenwood Post Independent, a lot of mountain town papers. We're owned by the same company, and we meet every month as editors, and I'm the leader of that group. And I said, hey, let's talk about these, and let's get a policy in place and see how we want to handle this. And so we worked on it for probably 6 months as an editor group and really tried to play devil's advocate in a lot of different spots and just kind of came up with this idea of, okay, if you've had your record expunged and you've made that effort, then we should acknowledge that as well.
Their approach works like this.
So what we really zeroed in on is misdemeanor things that really don't have a victim involved, right? Not, certainly not felonies, certainly not victim crimes, certainly not public interest or well-known public figures, elected officials, those kind of things. Those need to stay out there, I feel, because that shows character to their character. But some guy who came up here in 2004 and got weed back when weed it wasn't legal and had a misdemeanor, back in those days, we wrote crime stuff just about anything because, quite frankly, sometimes our crime reporters, they didn't have anything else to write. So they started, they'd start riffing on that. And so in hand with the right to be forgotten policy, we also really took a hard look at what kind of crime stories do we write and how do we handle them. And each of our websites, if you go to the bottom of aspentimes.com, there is a link that says submit a request to update a crime story. And then you open that up and there's a form in there to fill out and attach any kind of court documents. And our goal really isn't to remove stories as it is to amend a story and maybe take somebody's name out of it. And then at the bottom, we put an editor's note that says this story has been amended per our right to be forgotten in whatever the month is that we amended it. So that's kind of the ABCs of what we did.
David said that implementing a policy that works for his newsroom puts the Aspen Times ahead of the legislative curve.
I think the idea of the movement here was trying to get ahead of the courts and government telling us what we can and can't do on these kind of things. And I think that's where they've lost out, where we're taking the initiative to say, yeah, should these kind of nonviolent, non-victim crimes keep following people 10, 15 years later. I'm not talking about 2 years, and we're going to get rid of it. But if the courts are seeing fit to expunge things and have those sealed, and you're not running for government. Now, the question I have, or that I get from people is, well, what if they do run for public office in 10 years and we don't have a way to know that? And my response ideally or usually has been, then if you want to dig that much on a candidate, those kind of public records are still out there in some fashion. You can go on the Colorado Bureau of Investigation website page, put in somebody's name and their DOB, and find out if they've ever been arrested for anything. So that ability is still out there. Is it a little more nuanced? Yes, it is, but certainly those kind of situations might come up, but that's not for us to stand in the way of that, given the other parts of most of these things that people are trying to just move on from their life.
The idea of the right to be forgotten has spread from newsroom to newsroom across the country, and media companies have taken up the concept and made it into a movement that, in a way, allows people to move on but still preserves freedom of the press. Last year, the Associated Press announced it would no longer be naming suspects involved in minor crimes in their reporting. Gannett, the company that owns USA Today and hundreds of local newspapers across the country, announced in 2020 that it would no longer be publishing mugshot galleries on their websites. Here at Courthouse News, we handle takedown requests on a case-by-case basis.
So I think, should every newsroom do it? I think every newsroom should discuss it, and I think they should discuss how they're reporting crime. And if it fits up their content plan or how they want to approach what they're doing for their community, then yeah. But I think every newsroom should have a conversation about it and at least address it, because it's not going to go away. And to the point of, like I said, getting in front of it, I think it's important especially for small communities, large ones as well. But, giving people an opportunity to move on is something that if we're going to write about them, we owe them at least that consideration.
What have you tried to remove from the internet? Tweet us at Sidebar CNS. I want to hear about the whole nitty-gritty process. Follow Courthouse News on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube so you don't miss the next episode. I'll be talking about lingering election fraud conspiracies and Congress's own Great Resignation.